With Diablo IV's recent release and its first season around the corner, there's been a lot of conversation surrounding the game and the series as a whole. Newcomers to Diablo and gamers who have never played it may be wondering, what's the big deal with Diablo and why do people love and care about it so much? My goal in this video is to answer these questions and others by looking at the historical context of Diablo's release, its systems and gameplay, and the feedback and opinions of the players themselves. A quick disclaimer before we begin. There are as many reasons to like or dislike a game as there are people playing it. For brevity's sake, this is not an exhaustive list and is more focused on the qualities of the games that are generally appealing and the reasoning behind that appeal. So with that said, let's take a look at why people love Diablo. The year is 1996, and the landscape of the gaming industry looked vastly different from today. Role-playing games, or RPGs, have already been an established genre in the industry for years, and the 1990s had already seen its share of big RPG releases, such as Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, The Elder Scrolls I and II, with more to come later in the decade. What the genre lacked, however, were accessible RPGs with real-time combat. Enter Diablo. Developed by Condor Games, later known as Blizzard North, Diablo released in late 1996 with a unique mix of elements which made it stand out from the other games of the day. Fast-paced real-time action with great effects, procedurally generated levels, random loot, and online multiplayer. It was an accessible dungeon-crawling adventure you could have with friends, and its signature dark atmosphere and melancholy soundtrack captivated players. Now, these qualities got people into the game, but what kept players engaged and invested? In my view, there were two major factors: replayability and character growth. The randomization of levels and enemies meant that no playthrough of the game felt the same, and even after many hours of playtime, there could still be surprises in store for players. The randomization of loot likewise added to the replayability of the game, but it also contributed to the other factor, character growth. One of the main characteristics of RPGs is the growth or change of characters. In more open-ended games like Dungeons & Dragons, this can be reflected in a countless number of ways, from actual physical aging, gaining new knowledge, and developing relationships with other characters, to gaining levels, learning new spells, and finding magic items. Your imagination is the limit when it comes to your character. Video games are a little more restricted in their options due to design limitations, but their characters can still grow through story events, obtaining gear, gaining levels, stats, and skills. Diablo leans heavily on the gear, stats, and skills end of the character development spectrum. The vast majority of playtime in the game will be spent increasing character power through leveling up and obtaining loot, and the game reinforces this growth in a very tangible way by letting you slaughter monsters faster and faster, leading to more and more loot. It's a very satisfying loop and keeps the player wanting more. Blizzard had struck gold with Diablo, and with a proven formula under their belt and a growing fan base for their fledgling IP, Blizzard almost immediately began to develop a sequel title for the Diablo series, Diablo II. Released in 2000, Diablo II iterated on and expanded many of the first game's core elements, while adding many new features. It had more of everything, more areas to explore, more enemies, more classes, more skills, more loot with an expanded loot system, and so much more. One standout addition is the hardcore mode, which gave players a new way to experience Diablo. Permanent character death meant that players had to focus more on their character's defensive capabilities and play more tactically. The expansion for Diablo II, Lord of Destruction, further refined the balance of the game and added new features such as runes, which could be combined to create powerful effects on gear, new classes, the Druid and Assassin, and a new act for the story campaign. The staggering list of features, combined with improved visuals and a great soundtrack, created an unforgettable dungeon crawling experience that still has people playing it to this day, thanks in part to the game's re-release as Diablo II Resurrected in 2021. Diablo II was so influential in the gaming industry that it single-handedly created an action RPG subgenre, which I like to call isometric looter action RPGs, that now includes games like Path of Exile, Grim Dawn, Last Epoch, and Wolcen, and its influence is felt in games like Lost Ark, which somewhat emulate the feel of Diablo while falling into a different genre. After Diablo II's success, anticipation for a sequel built up over the years, especially since there were few games to compete with Diablo in the action RPG space. Blizzard officially announced in 2008 that Diablo III was in development, and when the game finally released in 2012, expectations were high. Diablo III had a lot to live up to, and in some ways it did. The game featured a variety of beautifully realized environments, interesting class designs like the Witch Doctor and Wizard, high-quality cinematics throughout its narrative, and satisfying combat featuring a diverse array of abilities. The game also expanded the world of Sanctuary and its lore by introducing new locations and characters of demonic and angelic origin. Unfortunately, the game's release wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for Blizzard. The game's early days were plagued with connection issues, which made the game borderline unplayable, like the infamous Error 37 message, which meant that the game's servers were overloaded and more players were not allowed to log in. This brought to light an issue which some players found frustrating. In contrast to Diablo I and II, the game required an active internet connection to play it, even if someone wants to play alone. Players with poor or limited internet access either couldn't play the game at all, or had a suboptimal or laggy experience. Those who enjoyed hardcore mode were especially affected because a random bout of lag could mean the permanent death of a character due to factors beyond the player's control. Another controversial addition to the game was the Real Money Auction House, an in-game market that allowed players to buy and sell items for both in-game and real-world currency. While some players welcomed the ability to trade items in a regulated environment, others voiced concerns that easy access to trading would affect the game's balance and encourage paying to win, instead of progressing naturally by finding your own items. The Real Money Auction House was eventually shut down by Blizzard shortly before the release of Diablo III's expansion, Reaper of Souls, in 2014. The release of Reaper of Souls added several new features to Diablo III, like the Crusader class, Adventure Mode, which allowed players to freely explore the world after beating the main story campaign of the game, the Mystic Artisan, who allowed players to enchant items to modify their stats, and Nephilim Rifts, randomly generated dungeons players could conquer. The expansion also overhauled the loot system, changing up itemization and adding legendary and set items to allow players to create new playstyles for their classes. Reaper of Souls was generally well received by the player base for addressing many of the issues with the base game of Diablo III, and Blizzard continued to support the game through new seasons, during which players can create new characters to receive exclusive rewards, and the eventual release of the Necromancer class as a separate DLC in 2017. The game had a rough start and its share of flaws, but Diablo III managed to find its place as an accessible action RPG game with a straightforward progression system, fun classes, and loads of loot. While Diablo III had its appeal to certain demographics of gamers, others were looking for a different experience, and over the years, the isometric looter action RPG genre grew with the inclusion of previously mentioned games like Path of Exile and Grim Dawn. Eyes were once again on Blizzard to see how the company would respond to the competition. For a long time, there was no real talk about Diablo from Blizzard, and it seemed that they had almost forgotten about the franchise, until 2018, when Diablo Immortal was announced during the opening ceremony of BlizzCon. This announcement was met with a mixed response from the community. With the success of Hearthstone, it made sense financially for Blizzard to further expand into the mobile gaming market, but fans of the series were expecting a mainline Diablo title for PC and consoles, and the idea of a mobile Diablo was disappointing. Fortunately for them, Blizzard didn't wait long to give players what they had been waiting for. Diablo IV was announced 1 year later at the opening ceremony for BlizzCon 2019, much to the excitement of the community. With 2 Diablo titles in development, the franchise continued to draw attention until the release of Diablo Immortal in the summer of 2022. Released on both mobile devices and PC, Diablo Immortal set several firsts for the series. It was, of course, Blizzard's first mobile Diablo title, and the game's design, from the user interface to class abilities, reflected this. The game used on-screen touch controls for mobile devices, and the resource management of most classes was replaced with abilities with cooldowns and an ultimate gauge, which would fuel a class's most powerful skills. A very easy playstyle to adapt to a mobile control scheme. Immortal was also the first Diablo game to feature a shared, persistent world where players could encounter each other, making the game fall into the massively multiplayer online RPG genre. Otherwise, the game looked and played very similarly to Diablo III, though with higher graphical fidelity. Most of the classes from Diablo III also made a return in this iteration, though the Witch Doctor was conspicuously absent. Upon its release, Immortal would immediately ignite a storm of controversy surrounding the monetization of the game. Since before its release, it was known that Diablo Immortal would be a free-to-play mobile title with some alternate form of monetization, but the amount of money needed to max out a character through upgrades was surprisingly high, estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The community was split in their response to the game's monetization. While more casual players were able to complete most of the game's content without spending money, players who wanted to optimize their equipment or to compete in PvP were at a severe disadvantage compared to someone who did spend on the game. While controversial among the Diablo fandom, it is difficult to argue with Diablo Immortal's quality and success. The game boasts great visuals, sound design, and combat for a mobile title. It's intuitive to pick up and play and manages to replicate the Diablo experience in a portable medium, albeit with some simplifications. Finally, it introduced the Diablo franchise to a new audience, as according to Blizzard, approximately 50% of registered accounts for Diablo Immortal were new Blizzard accounts, meaning they had probably never played a Blizzard game before. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's safe to say that Blizzard will continue to invest in Immortal's development to maximize their reach in the mobile market. And now, more than 25 years since the release of the original Diablo, Diablo IV has finally been released on June 6, 2023. Following the tumultuous history of Diablo III and the controversy of Diablo Immortal, there was some uncertainty leading up to the game's release about whether it would meet the expectations for a modern action RPG, but the initial reception to the game has been pretty positive. In typical Diablo fashion, the game features an intriguing narrative, woven together with dynamic cutscenes and, of course, the slaying of legions of monsters, as well as epic boss encounters. The game world is large, open, and is a shared space with other players, much like Diablo Immortal before it. One notable change in style from Diablo III is the consistently dark and dreary environments, more reminiscent of Diablo II. This really shows that Blizzard acknowledges that players gravitate towards Diablo's signature dark aesthetic. As the game is still in its infancy, it's difficult to gauge what Diablo IV's lasting legacy will be, but early impressions from the community have been generally positive, and it seems that there's a lot to love about the latest entry in the franchise. It's easy to get into, it has great presentation, it's playable with friends without jumping through any hoops, and killing monsters is just really dang fun. There are certainly problems with the game, but those will hopefully be ironed out with time. And speaking of time, what does the future hold in store for Diablo? One thing that's fairly certain is that it's not going anywhere anytime soon. The financial figures for recent Diablo releases have been impressive, and Blizzard's continued efforts to tap into new audiences seem to have worked to bring new fans into the fold. With new content releasing for both Diablo Immortal and Diablo IV in the form of seasons, classes, and possible future expansions, Diablo fans will have plenty to keep them entertained in the future. Even Diablo III and Diablo II Resurrected are getting new seasons, which is quite impressive, because it's typically very rare for a video game company to support several products from the same series like this. I personally have been putting a lot of time into Diablo II Resurrected, while also looking forward to Diablo IV's first season, and I'd love to hear what Diablo games everyone else is enamored with currently, and what your favorites are in the series. Thanks for listening to my Diablo rant, I hope you enjoyed it. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you did, because I'd like to discuss more gaming topics and would love your feedback and support.